Thank you everyone for joining us today. Before I get into all of the report overview and the weeds of that, I want to introduce myself and introduce CARE and our work that we do at the Labor Center. So as someone said, I'm Deja Thomas, the program manager for the Center for the Advancement of Racial Equity at Work, and we are housed within the UCLA Labor Center. The mission of CARE at Work, which is what we'll call it moving forward today, is to engage Black workers and economic justice advocates and facilitate innovative solutions that address the needs of Black working class people. We do that through a school to movement pathway of service, teaching, and capacity building, as well as research, which is the focus today. And then our purpose really is to reveal and the conditions of Black workers and Black work in Southern California under global racial capitalism and innovate, incubate, and support models and approaches for change. And we do that through the UCLA Labor Center, which has a long history of innovating that work alongside community groups, worker centers, unions, and elected officials and labor agencies. So we're really excited to continue that work and to really bridge and focus the work of CARE at Work. We are housed at the Labor Center, but we are a project that is a partnership between the Labor Center and the LA Black Workers Center. So our goal and the roots of everything we do is rooted in what is actually happening in the field and what's actually going on with Black workers. And that is really where Essential Stories as a project kind of came about, in doing outreach for Black workers around the different COVID-related worker protections. It was very clear that there was no real research or firsthand account available of what was actually happening with Black workers in Southern California in particular. And so that's where the Essential Stories research project that ran tandem to the outreach project came about. Their focus was really to understand, as I said, what was happening with Black workers and their work conditions and then how that impacted their experience through the pandemic as a whole. And that was really supported in part through the outreach project was supported in part through the Labor Workforce Development Agency's COVID Workplace Outreach Project, which supported the outreach work and then the survey work we did through CARE. So that's kind of the background of how we got there. It was led by myself and a few other researchers on our team. And then I'll go over the methods and also just share kind of the Black worker narratives that came out through the data. I think the really cool thing about our survey is we were able to capture narratives both of the actual data and the numbers and how folks responded, but we were also able to capture the qualitative and the actual kind of contextual experiences of Black workers. So you can go ahead to the next slide. And so really the methods we really use, and I want to make sure we really spend a little bit of time here today, we're with using the research justice model, which is really a model that, you know, we did not start, we did not create, but we very much applied through this process, which is really the idea that the focus and the goal, the most marginalized that research is focusing on should be centered throughout the entire process. And so the Worker Center and the Southern California Black Worker Hub for Regional Organizing were involved in the entire research process, from needing the research in the first place, from developing the methods, helping with outreach and dissemination of the survey. And we also did several like data analysis workshops with those folks who are actually doing work in the field to better contextualize and make sure that the work of the report was actually reflecting and uplifting what Black workers were actually saying on the ground. And key to that also is the recommendations of the report. One of the survey questions explicitly was, what do you need from worker centers, from state, local, and federal government agencies to recover and also continue to live throughout this pandemic? And we took those recommendations, contextualized them with what the worker centers and the hub were saying, and that's where the recommendations in the report are coming from. And so they're not just kind of based on what we think based on the data. This is what actual folks doing this work are actually saying. And then, like I said, this project ran alongside an outreach project, which in the outreach project was also doing discussions, sharing information around their rights and also sharing information around wellness, as we know that the surveying period was about this time last year. So we were a little bit over a year into the pandemic, and there was a strong need for wellness support for workers. And then the survey also was disseminated through text and phone banking. The outreach work to get resources to folks ended up actually engaging texting over 40,000 Black workers in SoCal, engaging in back and forth conversations with about 14,000 Black workers throughout SoCal. And then of that, about 2,000 of those workers actually took the survey. But the other 12,000 workers were engaged through texting, or they went to listening sessions, or they ended up going to the IEBWC's resource fair and things like that. So they are still engaged in other ways. And so I think if we shift to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more around the data and what was collected. And so, like I said, the survey really looked at, we collected demographic data to just understand like who were the Black workers we were talking to. It was majority Black women that responded to the survey. It was also majority Black women who were a guardian or parent of some sort to children under the age of 18. And we also collected data and questions around what their work conditions were before the pandemic, whether they were employed. We looked at if they were still employed during the pandemic, and if they were on-site or off-site, what kind of treatment and what conditions of that work happened and how their needs were being accommodated. And then we also had two sections, one on just COVID-19 in general, in terms of like, have they been exposed? What's their concern level? Have they had coworkers who've been exposed? How have they been able to access the care that they need? And then the third section, which was really focused on how COVID and the work conditions are impacting other areas of their lives. So asking questions around housing, food, their stress levels, et cetera. And so from that, we have these 4 big findings, which I think if you're in the work and you're in the field, a lot of the worker centers, the Black Worker Hub folks were not super shocked by these findings, as they are like very sobering and very bleak. But I think what I really took from this process and took from this is that this is a moment where there can be a lot of change, and there are a lot of solutions coming directly from the same people that shared these sobering conditions. It's just a matter of how do we tell those stories to make sure that that was communicated. And that's why I'm excited to be able to talk to y'all today and really have this focus on the journalists and things like that, because I think the storytelling of the crisis and the storytelling of the solutions is also important in the solution itself. Like, how do we get folks to actually understand what's happening? And I think this particular session came about because in the release of the report, which was released February 28th, so we got right in under Black History Month, and doing all the different interviews and talking with folks throughout that kind of press release process after a report comes out. There was like a clear desire to better understand what's happening with Black workers, and this report being like the first time that some folks shared that they had a report about Black workers, and then they had issues trying to figure out how to access data to be able to tell those stories in their work. And so that in like kind of our debrief session of that release, we realized it would be useful to kind of share how we go about looking at data in the research world, because it can closely mirror how you all go about looking at data when you're doing journalism as well. And so really the big kind of 4 findings, there was an unaddressed Black jobs crisis, which we defined the Black jobs crisis years ago with the LA Black Workers Center and the Labor Center research really focused on thinking about the 3 main components, which was high levels of unemployment, high levels of underemployment, and systemic racism as a whole, all 3 working together that keeps Black workers either out of a job or forces Black workers into low-wage exploitative work, all while still dealing with systemic racism in all aspects. And so all of those things contribute and create a Black jobs crisis. And we saw that during this pandemic where Black workers went in already with the highest levels of unemployment, and then that just jumped up along with everyone else's, and it still hasn't recovered in the same way that other groups have recovered. We saw discriminatory practices pushing Black workers out of employment. So about a third of Black workers reported experiencing prejudice or discrimination at work, specifically during the 1-year period of the pandemic at that time of surveying. And then the insufficient systemic support. So if Black workers, they were often the first to get let go or pushed out with COVID. From their perspective, COVID being the excuse for that. And they had to access other resources to support themselves and their family. They received insufficient systemic support. So, for example, 71% of on-site workers were concerned about their safety due to the potential for exposure to COVID on the job. But at the same time, there are laws and compliance measures in place that are supposed to keep these workers safe. But in addition to knowing about the rights available to them, in addition to being able to actually advocate, in addition to being able to actually file claims for themselves, like the support system to do that didn't exist before COVID. So how do we expect folks to actually do that in the middle of a pandemic? And then the last piece was about 60% of Black women rated their stress levels 4 or 5 on a scale of 1 to 5, compared to 52% of Black men. And so just really thinking about the lack of care infrastructure in the workplace. So we have a few questions just around how folks were supported as their needs at home changed, as their family members got sick, as they got sick, how folks were actually supported in that process. We have data on, and also how all of those things combined contributed to their stress levels. And we also have that data based on, like, as we said, because we collected demographic data, we're able to look at it by age, by gender, and also by location as well. And so those are kind of like the big kind of buckets of work that the Essential Stories report provides in terms of data around what is happening with Black workers. And I think they really speak to these larger kind of Black worker narratives that as CARE at Work, we're really trying to understand and also make sure other people understand. So if you shift to the next slide, I already talked about some of these things, but one of this being the Black jobs crisis. There's a narrative around Black workers that we all know is rooted in systemic racism, goes all the way back to chattel slavery and all of those things around Black workers being lazy, Black workers not wanting to work, not wanting to put in the work. But we know that that's not the case. Just looking at the data that we've collected, that's not the case. Even looking at unemployment data specifically, Black workers didn't, if we look at the data, Black workers didn't recover from the 2008-2007 financial crisis, if you're rating it by unemployment rates, until January 2020, and we all know what then proceeded to happen. And so the unemployment data is a useful tool to understand like what's happening, but we know that even the calculation for how they calculate the unemployment rate like doesn't necessarily include workers who are chronically unemployed and haven't been able to find a job for more than a year. They're not included in that number, so that number is often can be underreported. And then the other thing with that number is that it just includes jobs. Like it doesn't take into account whether it's a good job or a job that pays someone a living wage or a job that has benefits. And that's kind of where underemployment comes in, which is, there's a lot of different folks that have different understandings, but at its core, it's really around folks being forced into low wage sector jobs. So they're employed, so they're not counted in the unemployment data, but maybe they're employed in a sector or in a workplace where they are experiencing wage theft, where they are being discriminated against, where they are barely not even making enough money for them to be able to afford rent. And so now they have 3 different jobs to do that. So the unemployment number is useful, but there's a lot of stuff underneath it that you don't necessarily always capture. And underemployment is sometimes we like to look at like sectors that we know are low wage sectors, like warehousing, like retail and things like that, and look at that number to see like how many people are in those sectors or are making maybe low wages, et cetera, to see like the job crisis is much bigger than just folks finding a job. Is it a good job? Is it a quality job? Is it a family sustaining job that can cascade into a thriving family and community environment? And then there's also some racism. You can have a good job, you have good benefits, you can have all of those things, but still be facing racism at your job that might push you into unemployment or prevent you from getting the promotion that you should have gotten or prevent you from getting the pay raise that you should have gotten. So regardless of where you fall in the sectors or where you fall in the income category, you are Black workers are still dealing with this Black jobs crisis that oftentimes gets flipped and twisted in times because of systemic racism and other things. And so really thinking about how this data that actually tells you what's happening with the unemployment number, what are the sectors that folks are concentrated in and why, and actually hearing from folks why, and then just understanding the impacts of systemic racism in general. And so that is the kind of overview of the data and the ways in which the Essential Stories report has a lot of data that speaks to all of these narratives and speaks to all these points around reporting on Black workers, both that are specific to this moment, but also are just good understandings and reflect kind of long-standing longitudinal studies as well that kind of say the same thing. And so I think in the schedule, so that's kind of really what Essential Stories Report can bring to this conversation around how do you use data and reports and research to tell stories around Black workers that are reflecting what's actually happening. There are also other tools and resources available outside of the work of CARE. We are one center. We are in our second programmatic year. So there are a lot of other folks doing this work, and there are a lot of resources. I will pass it to Tila. I'll let you introduce yourself and share some of those resources.
Hi, everyone. I guess it's afternoon there. I'm on the East Coast, so it's around almost 4:30 here, but really a pleasure to be here talking a bit about, I guess, the challenges I've encountered in this work. Just briefly, I am a doctoral candidate at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, currently working on research that looks at Black worker centers, and specifically working with a number of the amazing people on this call in LA in the Southern California area. And so, just wanted to share a few things that hopefully can be helpful as you all are thinking about this work that you're doing. So I'm going to pretty much touch on three, I think, main things really briefly. One is just about where to go to find data on Black workers. I won't bury the lead, but we can do better. That's partially, obviously, why we're having this talk, but I'll talk a bit more about where there are some sources to be helpful to you. Second, just going to touch a bit on framing of some issues, although I think Deja did a really nice job offering several perspectives that I think are really useful. And then briefly, I'll just talk about how you might be able to address issues around disaggregation of data and proportionality. And so, just first, if we can go to the next slide, really, this question of like where to go find data. So, most of you here are journalists, and so you probably already know this, right? That the search for any kind of answers to questions, right, implies a certain perspective, right? And so really where to go is a function of like what kind of data you're looking for. So I'll just start out at the top by saying this this cheat sheet that is shown, and we'll share that with you all as well, really focuses on your more traditional labor, or I wouldn't say labor, but work and employment kinds of issue or data points that you might, want to better understand, which is to say that, when we're talking about Black workers or just labor in general, almost every issue sort of intersects with the experience of workers. And so this here, though, really focuses on your more traditional work and employment. So I just wanted to like frame this document with that. So I'll just briefly take you through, I think, some key issues that are highlighted here, or key topics and some key data sets, some of which you might already be aware of. I think it's useful just to think about what are the data sets that I might be able to use and leverage, and what is possible with them. So first one being, right, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's several things that you can do, I think, with this, but there are some trade-offs and challenges, I would say. So one is the current employment statistics data. That's where you're going to get your more general, I think, national level data on employment, hours, and earnings. The big issue there is it actually doesn't break down or disaggregate by race or any other demographic type. So you're going to get your broad sweeping trends there. JOLTS data, which is Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, that's really where, a lot of is what it sounds like, your data that's going to be on hires and separations, and that's largely done by reporting of companies themselves, is where you're going to find that. I would add much of the Great Resignation stories that we're seeing right now, and a lot of the data there is generated by this JOLTS data. Again, though, the challenge here is it doesn't produce demographic data. Third is the CPS, or the Current Population Survey, which is administered collectively between the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau. This one does allow you to go to the demographic level, and it's really, as it says here in the document, it's a monthly household survey that provides, a fair amount of comprehensive information on employment and unemployment. Again, breaks down by demographics such as age, sex, race, and ethnic origin. These are going to be your, sort of, when you see a lot of like when you talk about government data and surveys, it's generally going to be coming from, that's broken down demographically. It's generally going to be coming from this. Now, if you do want to go to sort of be below the sort of national trend level, they do have a resource, which is the local area unemployment statistics, where you actually can go to state or even local level. So that's something to explore. I will say I've never reached out to their staff, and I don't know if any of you on the call have, but so I can't vouch for how effective they are, but that is a possible resource. So those are kind of, I think, your larger government types of data sets where you're going to probably get there's always a question about credibility when it comes to that, but you're going to get as probably robust as you can get from those data sets. You all know this. All data, in some ways, there are trade-offs that have to be made, and especially when we're dealing with Black folks or any other, largely marginalized groups, data and getting information is really challenging. Some of you might already know this, but I would add, I think it's an important point that particularly during the pandemic, it's been even more challenging. With any disaster, it can be challenging. And so this is where, your ability to collect qualitative data, as Deja has talked about and what they've done in CARE, that sort of complements quantitative, broader data sets, but also where there might be gaps, is going to be a really important part of being able to tell these stories. Many of you may have already heard about the American Community Survey data. Now, that is probably one of your most, I think, robust places to get data that does go by demographic level on a whole range of issues. It's a nationwide survey. I mean, this is Census Bureau, right? So it's very much connected to that. It's done annually, though. So, it's supposed to be capturing larger, broader trends. It's not listed on this current one you're seeing here, but we will be sending out an updated version tomorrow to folks that includes this. But some key issues you're going to be able to look at through this are class of workers, commuting, employment status, food stamps, SNAP, healthcare coverage, income and earnings, and other types of occupation data, including work status over the years. Again, it's annual, nationwide, but it actually goes you can get pretty localized with this data set, which is useful. Again, knowing there's going to be some limitations to the data. Race counts is another one, which really, measures racial disparity. This is focused on California. So if you're, focused, obviously, most of you here, I assume, if not all of you, are in the state of California. This is probably going to be a really useful one for you. So, I think, again, going back to the point I made earlier, a lot of this is about really, what are you trying to get at and understand? And I wanted to frame it in that way because even for me, when I was thinking about what to offer, I mean, if we're talking about politics or other, right, health, other things that obviously impact and connect to the state of Black workers, right? You're not necessarily going to get this here. And so this is where you would need to like leverage other kinds of data sets. And so I just wanted to make sure I was transparent about that this is not what we're talking about here. The other thing I would just say is what's also here is, there are a number of think tanks or policy institutes that I think are worth noting here that do a fairly good job of collecting data and doing reporting on Black workers. So we've highlighted several here. Aside from CARE, I think that EPI, they have the Economic Policy Institute has a program on race, ethnicity, and economy. They've been known to do some fairly good work. Some important reports have come out in the last several years. We've put a couple of contacts here at each place that, it might be useful if you can connect with them. Again, as you all know, as journalists, a lot of this is about building relationships and having folks who can kind of give you deeper insight into the numbers, into the data, particularly where you might be looking to try to understand a dynamic. So EPI, I think, has done some strong work in the last few years, or 1 to 2 years particularly. CEPR is another one. They had some really important data come out at the very end of last year that really was able to show that Blacks and Asians were lagging the rest of the workforce in the pandemic recovery. And there's a gentleman there, Algernon Alston. And then Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I wouldn't say they are like collecting and doing their own studies on Black workers specifically, but every now and then they can be a place to go to look for reports that might be useful. Now, here, these are, as you might already know, these are like more progressive think tanks. You all know there's going to be trade-offs and challenges with a lot of these, but I just wanted to point you in the direction of some where if you're looking for reports that really are from institutes that take seriously the issue of looking at what's happening with Black workers, at least from a data-driven standpoint, they can be a resource. Although, more localized information in California and LA, I would say, CARE, CARE and the folks that work with CARE are probably going to be a really critical, important resource for you. I'm not going to say too much about framing. I know I'm low on time. I think Deja really kind of hit it, but it's really, again, this point that, the world is obsessed with unemployment, and really the story that's often missed is underemployment. And it really needs to be talked about in tandem, the two together. It always frustrates me when we see these unemployment reports that come out that talk about how the economy is rebounding. And one, typically, persistently and historically, Black workers are lagging. And two, with many and most workers probably right now, but also particularly Black workers, underemployment is really the challenge. The jobs are just low quality. And so any work you can be doing around that to highlight that mobility really needs to be about looking at both of those indicators, I think is really important work to be done. And then just last is really this issue, if we can go to the next slide, just disaggregation. I don't want to say too much on this. I think most people here understand what it means, right, to disaggregate data is really be able to break down these big, large data sets into smaller subcategories and to cut them, right, based on race, gender, level of education, or various things. And the reason why we do that, right, is to be able to reveal, right, inequities or inequalities across groups that aren't necessarily reflected in larger, more aggregated data sets. And to reveal sort of patterns that might be masked by larger aggregate data. And so here, the point isn't really, I mean, I know you all journalists, you may or may not be, statistic analysts here. If you're lucky and have that capability in-house where you are, it's important to be able to leverage that. But I think the message to get across here is to know that this exists, right? And to know this is an important part of understanding stories of Black workers and their experiences. And to know that this is where it's really important to be able to, one, work alongside folks like CARE and other places, right, who have more of a grip on not just data, but also these narratives and stories and how it tracks with data and trends over time, to be able to identify, well, what kind of stories can be told to be able to address some of the gaps that we may or may not be able to get through the quantitative data. And just connected to this, the last slide is this point on proportionality. Again, I see it as the other side of the coin of disaggregation, but really, again, you all know this, like often, I think in the last 2 years, I probably, when talking about Black worker issues, have used the term disproportionately impacted, like almost every time, right? Because we know on almost most key indicator of health and wellness, we are lagging. And here's this important point that, I think it's important to highlight. You may already know, but similar to why disaggregation of large data is really important to understand what's happening sort of below the surface, proportionality is another one, right? So while we may be a small percentage of a broader population, if we are experiencing and impacted by something at a larger time or rate than that percentage of that we exist, right? Like this is a problem, right? We are being disproportionately impacted, which is why we need to be looking at these issues. So I don't know, Deja or Elda, if you wanted to add anything to that. I just want to make sure I'm hitting the key pieces on anything that I've talked about, but happy to answer any questions that folks on the call have, either now or towards the end.
No, I think you said that perfectly. I know we have set aside a little bit of time before shifting into some of the resources for some of that qualitative piece that Elda will talk about. If there are any questions around what I shared or what Fila shared, or about any of those resources, we have a little bit of time for like a little Q&A before we kind of wrap up. You put it in the chat, or you could do the raise hand function if you would like. If there are no questions or no readily available questions, like I said, you can keep putting them in the chat, and obviously you can continue to reach out and we will follow up as well. But I will pass it to Elda. You can introduce yourself and share kind of some of these resources to get that qualitative actual narrative outside of just the data.
Yeah, thank you, Deja. Hi, everyone. My name is Elda Solomon, she, her, the policy manager with the Southern California Black Worker Hub for Regional Organizing. I'm currently based in San Francisco. And thank you, Fila, for giving us that really thorough rundown of some of the avenues and journalists and other data seekers can pursue, trying to find data and information on Black workers and the condition of the Black jobs crisis, and really summing up, I think, in a really strong way and concise way, the issue of disaggregation and proportionality. As we begin to learn more about the ways that journalists and other data seekers can access this information on their own, it's really important to note that there are a wide variety of community-based organizations that are located in and around Southern California that many times have already done the heavy lifting and already have a wealth of knowledge. And this is because that these organizations are well versed on Black worker issues because they work directly with local Black workers and communities and organize around Black worker issues and concerns. These include the regional Black worker centers in LA, Inland Empire, and San Diego, including the National Black Worker Center, which is not directly connected to us, but is a really strong partner with our work. And all of these regional Black worker centers, like I said, work and organize directly around Black workers and Black worker issues. So they're really strong partner and resource for your work and trying to gain and learn more information about the kinds of things that are happening with Black workers currently, and some of the things that data and cold data really cannot necessarily represent and tell the entire story. And that's what makes projects like Essential Stories coming out of UCLA CARE work so special, is because it goes beyond the data to sort of encapsulate the way that Black workers are really experiencing the jobs crisis and the pandemic and many other things as well. All of these organizations work directly with the Southern California Black Worker Hub as an infrastructure and capacity arm. That's where I work. And UCLA CARE at Work, which is where Deja led the Essential Stories research out of, which also informs a lot of our work as the research arm, and has helped us to illuminate a lot of the kinds of issues that we're hoping to tackle as the hub. Other community-based organizations that we partner with include the Earth Lodge Center for Transformation, Blue Educational Foundation, Center on Policy Initiatives, and Congregations Organized for Prophetic Engagement, or COPE. These organizations also are a super great resource for you all because of the years of service that they've committed to this work. A lot of them have been around even longer than UCLA CARE at Work, the hub of the Black Worker Centers even, and really anchor our work as well. What's really important about the work that they've done and that we do is, like I said, again, we learn from workers. We're directly informed by workers as grassroots organizers and organizations. And from the research of UCLA that sort of holds us down and provides our research arm and support. As a so-called hub, we are in community with these organizations and many other organizations across the country that contribute to our wealth of knowledge on employment, workforce development, Black workers, and their kind of changing conditions as they go through the pandemic, as we're most certainly going to be met with an economic recession and lots of other things. And there's a lot of data on how Black workers have sort of fared in the past when it comes to economic moments of economic kind of lull, and how Black workers recover, and also the ways that even in times of economic prosperity, that Black workers seem to sort of lag, even behind their white counterparts and other groups. So the Southern California Black Worker Hub, we're working through trying to address some of these themes and issues that have come out of the Essential Stories work in our regional campaigns, which for right now includes our large campaign, which is the Build Black Better for All campaign. Like I said, this campaign is largely informed by what we've learned from the Essential Stories project, and we're hoping to launch soon through the hub and working through a way to address some of the qualitative and contextual experiences that Black workers have raised in this report. We're working to strengthen Black worker pathways to jobs in the construction industry, which we recognize as an industry where there are many quality jobs that can address many of the issues that Black workers have raised, and what they're really saying on the ground. So if you'd like to stay connected with the Build Black Better campaign or the hub as it progresses with our work, please let me or any of the CARE at Work folks know, and we'll make sure to keep you in contact and on the know with some of the progressions for the Build Black Better for All campaign. We're hoping to launch really, really soon, and hoping to invite you all. So please consider again reaching out to the regional Black worker centers and other community-based organizations as a resource as you continue your work. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. And with that, I will hand it off to Deja.
Cool. So thank you so much for that robust sharing of the resources. I think it's really important that we're having conversations around data, building off of that research justice model that I shared at the top, that we can't have the conversations about the numbers and what all the resources to figure those numbers out are, without also having this same conversation at the same time about how to actually communicate, work with, and contextualize all of that with what's actually happening with real people. So really happy and grateful that Elda was able to join us and share some of those names and resources of folks that are great resources to better contextualize all of the different things related to Black workers, but then also especially the list of folks on the second slide. Some of their issue areas, while they focus on Black workers, they're also expansive as well. So things just related to Black folks generally, because workers are full of people. So if there are any, so we'll leave space for any, the last like 10 minutes or so for any Q&A, or even just like comments and discussions that folks might have to share. And so I'll leave it open for a few seconds if anyone wants to hop in with a question, comment. Oh, I see a hand, Krista Loretto. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for presenting all of this important data, all of the organizations, giving all of this context. I'm not a reporter. I work at UCLA in public policy and journalism. And I also am a doctoral student and doing research on tangentially related areas for instructor diversification, because we have a problem with that. There's opportunity to collaborate in what you presented in getting these stories out. The important part of remembering that, you know, there's data and there's people, and we have to use both to tell the stories. I also run something called UCLA X Open. We can, I'd love to talk with you about perhaps creating a workshop to put on this platform. It's worldwide, it's free. You know, the only thing is we have to create a course, or it can be over Zoom like this, but it's just another platform to present this research. And even because I have the journalism program, it's also an opportunity to look at whether we can bring journalists together to hear what you're talking about, and we can, you know, support presenting the information that you just provided, and anything else that's relevant to help build out, you know, these goals that you have.
Yes, thank you so much for offering. If you want to put your email in the chat, or you can direct message. I also put mine just in case anyone else. And I would love to follow up with you about that, because I do think, to your point, the telling the stories, and understanding both from like a really good and equitable and worker-centered lens is important for all, whether you're a researcher or a journalist or you're an organizer in the field. Thank you.
Sure.
All righty. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll do a last call. You can raise your hand. I'll hop off mute if you like. Thank you so much for joining us today. We, like as folks said, we will be sharing out the document that Fila went over with everyone, the PDF, and we'll also make sure to add the ACS survey information there as well. And feel free to continue to reach out to CARE or anyone else on the call, the hub, Fila, etc., and join the listers. As you just have questions and need any more information, we're excited to continue this work and to continue to support the field and to create a better California for everyone, and especially Black workers. So thank you so much for joining us. And you are free to, ending 8 minutes early, you can follow us on social media. There are the Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook links run by the amazing Simone. And also special shout out to Fila and Elda for joining today and helping to share their wisdom and knowledge with us. And also Paulette and Simone for helping to coordinate, organize, and put all of this beautiful event together. So thank y'all. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.